You don't get to speak. People like you serve. The sentence didn't echo. It sliced, clean and precise, cutting through the low hum of a Manhattan dining room, where every seat cost more than most people's weekly paycheck, where crystal glasses caught the amber light, and polished silverware reflected power dressed in tailored suits. And just like that, everything stopped. Forks hovered midair, conversations died in half-breaths, and every single staff member within earshot did the same thing they had learned to do over the past 3 months. They looked down, they stepped back, they disappeared, because Ethan Cole was not just another difficult customer. He was the kind of man who didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His reputation moved faster than sound. A billionaire CEO who could end careers with a sentence, and had done so often enough that fear had become part of the restaurant's atmosphere. Something you could almost taste between courses, thick and metallic. And tonight was no different, except for one detail no one had planned for. Naomi Carter, first shift, new uniform still stiff at the seams, name tag slightly tilted because her hands had been shaking just minutes ago when the manager pulled her aside and whispered the rule everyone already knew: stay away from table 7. Do not engage, do not respond, just survive the night. But rules like that only work when someone understands why they exist, and Naomi hadn't seen him yet. Not really. Not until she stepped into the soft glow of that corner table and felt the temperature change without a single degree dropping. Ethan didn't look up right away. He never did. He let silence do the work first, let people feel small before he ever spoke, and when he finally did, it wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was controlled, measured, the kind of tone that assumed obedience before it was given. Water, he said, not looking at her, not acknowledging her, just expecting. And Naomi moved, steady, precise, because she knew this part. She had worked long enough to recognize power when it tried to press down on her shoulders. But then it happened, a small movement, almost nothing, his hand brushing the glass just enough for it to tip. Water spilling across the pristine white linen like a stain no one wanted to claim, and for a split second, the room held its breath, because everyone knew what came next. The script had been written before she even walked in, and right on cue, Ethan leaned back, finally lifting his eyes, calm, almost bored. Apologize, he said, as if the truth didn't matter, as if it never did. And somewhere behind her, a server took a step back, another turned away, because they had seen this before. They had all seen what happened when someone hesitated, but Naomi didn't move. Not backward, not forward. She just stood there, breathing once, slow, deliberate. And in that breath lived every lesson she had carried with her into rooms like this. Every moment she had been overlooked, dismissed, reduced to a uniform instead of a person. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. It simply held its ground. "I'll take care of the table, sir," she said, each word placed carefully, like stepping stones across something deeper. "But I won't apologize for something I didn't do." And just like that, the silence changed, not empty anymore, but charged, alive, because for the first time in that room, someone hadn't disappeared for a moment. Ethan Cole did not respond, and that was what made it worse, because men like him were never quiet unless they were deciding how to win. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, not tense, not rushed, just controlled, as if the entire room existed on a timeline he alone managed. And then he smiled, not wide, not warm, just enough to signal that he had heard her and did not like what he heard. "You are new," he said slowly, his voice low enough that only the people closest could catch it, but somehow it still carried, because attention bent toward him whether invited or not. That explains the confusion. A few soft, uneasy chuckles rippled from a nearby table, not because it was funny, but because people in rooms like this often laughed when they felt uncomfortable, and Naomi noticed it. The way eyes shifted, the way no one stepped in, the way silence could feel like agreement even when it was not. But she did not look away. She did not shrink. She simply adjusted the napkin with calm precision, as if the moment had not just tilted in a direction that could cost her everything. And that was when something subtle changed, because Ethan expected resistance to crack, expected voices to fold under pressure, expected people to rush to correct themselves. But she did not, and that absence of fear, or at least the absence of visible fear, created a pause he had not planned for. "In this room," he continued, leaning back slightly, studying her now. We solve problems quickly, we do not debate them. The statement hung there, polished and deliberate, like a rule carved into marble, and across the floor, the manager had already started moving, not quickly, not obviously, but with that careful urgency of someone trying to contain a situation before it became something else, something visible, something that could not be undone. But Naomi spoke before he could reach them, not louder, not sharper, just steady. "Then I am solving it, sir," she said, her tone even, her posture unchanged. "The table will be clean, your service will continue, and the mistake will not be repeated because it was not mine to begin with." And this time, the silence did not feel like avoidance. It felt like attention, like something had shifted just enough for people to start watching instead of looking away, and that was dangerous. Because attention meant accountability, and accountability was something Ethan Cole rarely had to face in rooms like this. His jaw tightened, just slightly, a detail most would miss, but not Naomi, because she had spent years reading moments like these, learning that power often revealed itself in the smallest changes, not the loud ones. And for the first time that night, Ethan sat forward, placing both hands on the table, not aggressive, not abrupt, just intentional. "You think this is about the water," he said, quieter now, almost curious, as if testing the boundaries of something he had not encountered in a long time. And Naomi met his gaze fully, not challenging, not apologizing, just present. "No, sir," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no second guessing, just clarity. "It is about respect." And that word did something no raised voice could have done. It landed, heavy and undeniable, settling into the space between them like a truth no one had said out loud until now. And somewhere behind them, a glass clinked softly, someone shifting in their seat, someone paying closer attention than before, because moments like this did not happen often. Not in rooms built on quiet compliance, not in places where power usually went unchecked. And as the manager finally reached the edge of the table, ready to intervene, ready to smooth things over, to apologize on behalf of someone who had not done anything wrong, Ethan lifted a hand slightly, stopping him without even turning his head, his eyes still locked on Naomi. And in that small gesture, the balance shifted again, because now this was no longer about service, it was something else entirely, something neither of them could walk away from. Without consequence, the room did not breathe. It waited, because when power pauses, people learn to listen more carefully. And Ethan Cole had just chosen not to end the moment, which meant he was not finished. His fingers tapped once against the table, slow, deliberate, a rhythm that felt less like impatience and more like calculation. "Respect," he repeated, almost tasting the word as if it did not belong in a conversation like this. And for a brief second, something unreadable passed through his expression, not anger, not amusement. Something closer to curiosity, the kind that only appears when expectations are disrupted. And Naomi noticed it, not because she was looking for weakness, but because she understood presence, the kind that did not collapse under pressure, the kind that stayed still when everything around it tried to move. And she held that stillness now, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, not challenging him, not yielding either, just existing in a way that refused to be reduced, and that unsettled the balance more than any raised voice could have. "Do you know who you are speaking to?" Ethan asked, not louder, but sharper now, the question carrying weight. History, reputation, all the invisible things that usually ended conversations before they began. And somewhere across the room, someone shifted in their seat, because that question was not really a question. It was a reminder, a warning, a final chance to step back. But Naomi did not step back. She did not rush to answer either. She let the silence sit for a fraction longer than expected, just enough to make it clear that she was choosing her words, not reacting to his. And when she spoke, her voice was the same, calm, grounded. "Yes, sir," she said. And there was no hesitation in it. "I am speaking to a guest in this restaurant." And the simplicity of that answer did something unexpected. It stripped away everything else, the title, the wealth, the fear that had been building around his name, and reduced the moment to something smaller, something human. And that shift rippled outward, subtle but undeniable, because for the first time that night, Ethan was not being treated like a force, he was being treated like a person, and that was not something he was used to in places like this. His gaze narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if trying to understand the framework she was operating within, because it was not the one he controlled. And behind Naomi, the manager froze mid-step, unsure now whether stepping in would restore order or disrupt something that had already begun to change on its own. Interesting, Ethan said after a pause, leaning back again. But this time the movement felt different, less like dominance, more like distance, as if he was stepping back to observe rather than to command. And then he did something no one in that room expected. He reached for the glass, the one that had tipped, now empty, and placed it upright himself, not as a gesture of apology, not as an admission, but as an action that quietly acknowledged the moment had not unfolded the way he intended. And that small act carried more weight than any statement could have, because it introduced something new into the room. Uncertainty, and uncertainty was something power did not handle well. Then fix the table, he said, but the tone had shifted, still controlled, still firm, but no longer dismissive, and Naomi nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of the task, and as she moved to reset the setting with steady, practiced hands, the energy around them continued to evolve. Conversations did not fully return, not yet, but the way people looked had changed, less avoidance, more attention, more awareness, as if something invisible had been pulled into the light. And as Naomi placed the final glass down, aligning it perfectly with the others, she did not rush away, she did not retreat into the background, like the others had before her. She simply stood there for a second longer, grounded, composed, and in that second, the room understood something it had not recognized before. That power was not always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it was the one that refused to disappear. The air did not snap back to normal. It shifted, slowly, like something invisible had been moved and could not be put back in place. And for the first time that evening, the room no longer revolved entirely around Ethan Cole. It balanced, uneven but undeniable, between him and the woman who had not stepped aside. Conversations resumed in fragments, quieter than before, not because people lost interest, but because they were listening differently now, watching without pretending not to, and Ethan felt it, not as pressure, but as presence, the kind that does not announce itself yet changes everything. He leaned back in his chair, eyes still on Naomi as she finished aligning the final piece of silverware. With exact precision, her movements steady, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world in a place where time was usually dictated by people like him. And that contrast lingered, subtle but sharp, because control had always been his language, and she was no longer speaking it. "You are very composed," he said after a moment, his tone no longer edged with dismissal, but something closer to evaluation, like a man reassessing a variable he had underestimated. And Naomi met his gaze again, not as a challenge, but as acknowledgement. "I try to be, sir," she replied, her voice even, carrying neither pride nor apology, just truth. And that answer, simple as it was, carried a weight that did not belong to the words alone. It belonged to everything behind them. The discipline, the restraint, the decision not to react even when reaction would have been easier. And Ethan recognized it, not consciously, not yet, but somewhere beneath the surface, because people who build empires often understand control when they see it, even if it comes from a place they never expected. Most people in your position would have handled that differently. He continued, his fingers resting still now, no longer tapping, no longer measuring the moment, just present within it. And Naomi allowed a small pause before answering, not to create tension, but because she chose her responses the same way she chose her stance, deliberately. "Most people are trying to keep their job," she said, and there was no judgment in it, no bitterness, just observation, and that clarity did something the room could feel even if it could not name it. It reframed the situation without raising its volume, and across the dining floor, a man seated near the window lowered his glass slowly, his attention no longer divided, because something real was unfolding, something that did not rely on spectacle to hold weight. And Ethan exhaled quietly, a sound so subtle it might have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But here, now, it marked a shift, not defeat, not concession, but recognition. The kind that arrives when control meets something it cannot easily move. "What is your name?" he asked, and this time, It was not a demand, not a test, just a question, direct and unguarded in a way his earlier words had not been. And Naomi answered without hesitation, Naomi Carter. And she did not add anything more, did not expand, did not explain, because she did not need to. And that restraint carried its own authority, and Ethan nodded once, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but significant in a room that measured power through the smallest movements. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the conversation had already moved beyond words. It had entered something quieter, something more difficult to control, and as Naomi prepared to step away, to continue her shift, to return to the rhythm of a night that no longer felt the same, Ethan spoke again, not louder, not softer, but differently. Naomi, he said, and hearing her name in his voice carried a shift no one missed. Bring me another glass of water. And the request, simple as it was, no longer sounded like an order. It sounded like something else, something closer to respect, even if neither of them acknowledged it out loud. And as she nodded and turned, moving through a room that was now watching her instead of overlooking her, one thing had already changed, not the setting, not the stakes, but the balance. And once balance shifts, it does not return to what it was before. The request lingered in the air long after Naomi turned away, not because it was unusual, but because of how it was said. Her name carried in a tone that had shifted just enough for everyone to notice. And as she moved toward the service station, the quiet hum of the restaurant began to return in pieces, but it was different now, softer, more aware, like a room that had just witnessed something it could not fully explain. And behind the counter, another server leaned in slightly, voice low, almost cautious. You are still here, he whispered, not out of surprise, but out of disbelief, because people did not stand their ground with Ethan Cole and continue their shift as if nothing had happened. But Naomi did not answer right away. She reached for a clean glass, inspecting it briefly under the warm light before placing it on the tray, her movements steady, deliberate, the same way they had been moments before, because for her, the shift had never been about him alone. It was about something she carried long before she stepped into this room. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. I am just doing my job, she said, and that sentence, simple as it sounded, held more truth than anyone around her expected, because doing her job did not mean shrinking. It did not mean accepting what was not hers to carry. It meant showing up fully, even when the room expected less. And as she turned back toward table 7, tray balanced in one hand, posture unchanged, the distance between her and Ethan felt different, not shorter, not longer, but clearer, defined by something that had not been there before. And when she arrived, she did not rush, did not hesitate. She placed the glass gently in front of him, aligning it with the same precision as before, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that no longer felt tense, but intentional, as if both understood that the next words would matter in a different way. And Ethan watched her, not the way he had earlier, not scanning, not dismissing, but observing, the way someone studies something they had misjudged. Thank you, Naomi, he said, and the words were simple, expected even, but the tone carried something new, something that had not existed when the night began. And across the room, that shift did not go unnoticed. A couple at a nearby table exchanged a glance, subtle but knowing, because gratitude from a man like him was not common, not in spaces where he held all the leverage. And Naomi acknowledged it with a small nod. Nothing more, because she did not need to hold on to the moment. She did not need it to validate what she had already chosen. And as she began to step back, Ethan spoke again. Most people avoid difficult situations, he said, his voice measured, thoughtful now, not probing, not testing, just stating something he had likely believed for a long time. And Naomi paused, just briefly, not turning fully, but enough to respond. Most people are taught to, she replied. And there was no edge in her tone, just clarity, the kind that did not push but still moved the conversation forward. And that answer stayed with him, visible in the slight shift of his posture, the way he leaned forward just a fraction, as if considering something he had not needed to consider before. And for the first time that evening, the power in the room did not feel like it belonged entirely to him. It felt shared, not equally, not yet, but undeniably, and as Naomi walked away, returning to the rhythm of her shift, the room continued to adjust around that new balance. Conversations grew steadier, laughter returned, but under it all, there was a quiet understanding that something had been redefined, not through force, not through confrontation, but through presence. And once people witness that kind of shift, they do not forget it, even if they cannot explain why the rhythm of the night continued. But it no longer moved the same way. It carried a subtle shift, like a current just beneath the surface that only those paying attention could feel. And Ethan Cole was paying attention now, not to the room, not to the conversations rising back into polite noise, but to the absence Naomi had left behind when she stepped away, because something about that absence did not feel like relief. It felt like interruption, like a pattern broken in a system he had long believed he understood. He lifted the glass slowly, taking a measured sip, his gaze drifting across the room, but not settling, not claiming space the way it usually did. Instead, it searched, quietly, almost unconsciously, until it found her again, moving between tables with the same calm precision, the same steady pace, as if nothing about the last few minutes had altered her presence. And that consistency unsettled him more than resistance ever could have, because resistance he knew how to overcome. But composure like that did not offer anything to push against. It simply remained. And across the dining floor, something else had begun to change, small at first, almost unnoticeable. A guest holding eye contact a second longer than usual. Another offering a quiet thank you that carried more intention. A server stepping forward without hesitation, not out of obligation, but because the fear that once filled the space had thinned just enough to make room for something else. And Ethan noticed that too. Not in words, not in conclusions, but in feeling, the kind that does not announce itself but lingers. And for a man who built his life on control, that lingering mattered. He set the glass down gently, aligning it without thinking, mirroring the same precision he had watched earlier, and that small imitation did not go unnoticed by the woman seated 2 tables away, who paused mid-conversation, her attention shifting, because power changing shape is not something people miss, even when they do not understand it. And as Naomi approached again, not because she was called, but because the flow of service brought her back, Ethan straightened slightly, not in dominance, but in readiness, as if the conversation they had started had not ended, only paused. "You handle pressure well," he said. And this time there was no edge, no test hidden beneath the words, just observation. And Naomi met it the same way she had met everything else that night, steady, grounded. "It is part of the job," she replied. But there was something beneath it, something unspoken that suggested it was not just the job she was referring to. And Ethan heard that too, not fully, not clearly, but enough to recognize that her composure came from somewhere deeper than training. And that realization shifted something inside him, subtle but real, because it introduced a possibility he had not considered before. That strength did not always come from position. That control did not always belong to the person with the most power. And for a brief moment, he allowed that thought to exist without dismissing it, without correcting it, just letting it sit. And in that moment, the balance in the room adjusted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that the weight no longer leaned entirely in one direction. And as Naomi gave a small nod and moved on, continuing her work with the same quiet confidence, Ethan remained still, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to say anything at all. He was listening, not to her words, but to the space she had changed simply by refusing to disappear. And that kind of change, once noticed, does not fade easily by the time the second course arrived. The room had settled into something that looked normal on the surface. Glasses clinked, low laughter returned, waiters moved in practiced rhythm. But beneath it all, there was a quiet awareness that had not been there before, like a lens had been adjusted and no one could unsee what they had just witnessed. And Ethan Cole sat in the center of it, not as the unquestioned force he had been when he walked in, but as a man now sharing the space with something he could not easily define. His posture remained composed, his expression controlled, but his attention no longer scattered across deals and conversations. It followed a single point. Naomi Carter, not constantly, not obviously, but often enough to reveal a shift in priority. Because something about her presence did not fit into the categories he was used to managing. She did not react the way people usually did. She did not seek approval, did not retreat under pressure, and more importantly, she did not try to win. And that made her impossible to control in the ways he understood. And as she moved through the room again, checking on another table, offering a quiet reassurance to a guest, adjusting a detail no one else had noticed, the consistency of her composure became its own kind of statement, not loud, not performative, just steady, and that steadiness began to ripple outward. Other staff members stood a little straighter, spoke a little clearer, as if the invisible weight that had pressed down on them earlier had eased just enough to let them breathe differently. And Ethan noticed that too, not with irritation, but with something closer to recognition, because influence, real influence, did not announce itself. It revealed itself in shifts like this, subtle but undeniable. And for a man who had built his life measuring impact in numbers and outcomes, this kind of change did not fit his usual metrics, but it mattered all the same. He set his fork down slowly, not because he was finished eating, but because his focus had moved elsewhere entirely. And when Naomi approached once more, not summoned, not expected, just following the natural flow of service, he spoke again. But this time there was no trace of the man who had started the night. "Do you always hold your ground like that?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a question that carried genuine curiosity. And Naomi paused just long enough to acknowledge it, her expression calm, thoughtful, as if she had been asked something worth answering. "Only when it matters," she said, and the simplicity of her response carried a depth that lingered, because it suggested a boundary, a line drawn not by circumstance, but by choice. And that idea settled into Ethan's awareness in a way that no confrontation could have forced, because it introduced something he had not considered in a long time. That strength could be quiet, that authority could exist without control, and that respect, real respect, could not be demanded, only recognized. And for a moment, he did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because the usual responses no longer felt sufficient, and around them, the room continued its quiet transformation. Conversations flowed, but with a different tone, less guarded, more present, as if something had been recalibrated without anyone announcing it. And as Naomi gave a small nod and stepped away once more, Ethan remained still, not reaching for his glass, not returning immediately to his meal, just sitting in the space that had changed around him. And for the first time that evening, he was not the center of the room, and strangely, he did not try to be the final course arrived with the kind of quiet elegance the restaurant was known for, plates set down with precision, sauces brushed like art, everything measured, controlled, predictable. But the atmosphere no longer followed that same script. Something had shifted too deeply to be reset by routine, and Ethan Cole felt it in a way he could not ignore, not as pressure, not as challenge, but as absence. The absence of the unquestioned authority he was used to carrying into every room. And as he glanced around, he noticed something that would have gone unnoticed any other night. People were no longer adjusting themselves around him. They were simply existing. Conversations continued without hesitation. Servers moved without flinching. And at the center of that shift was not him. It was Naomi Carter, not because she demanded attention, but because she had changed the way attention worked. And that realization settled into him slowly, like a truth that did not need to be spoken to be understood. He set his napkin down beside his plate, not finished, but paused. And when Naomi approached again, this time with the final check, her posture remained the same, steady, composed, untouched by the weight that had once defined the table. "Whenever you are ready, sir," she said, her voice even, professional, giving him the same level of service she would offer anyone else. No more, no less. And that equality, that refusal to treat him as anything beyond what he was in that moment, a guest, carried more impact than any confrontation earlier in the night. Ethan looked at the check, then back at her, and for a brief second, the room seemed to narrow, not in tension, but in focus, as if everything that had unfolded was leading to this quiet moment. And when he spoke, his voice no longer carried the edge it once did. "You handled tonight differently than anyone else would have," he said, not as a question, not as a test, just a statement that acknowledged something he could no longer deny. and Naomi met his gaze, not searching for approval, not expecting anything in return, just present. "I handled it the way I needed to," she replied, and the simplicity of that answer landed with a clarity that left no space for interpretation, because it was not about him. It had never been about him. And that realization, quiet as it was, carried weight, the kind that does not force change, but invites it, and Ethan nodded slowly, a gesture that did not seek to reclaim control, but to accept what had already shifted. He reached for his pen, signing the receipt with the same precision that defined everything he did, but when he set it down, he did not slide the folder away immediately. Instead, he paused, looking at her again, really looking this time, not as a server, not as a role, but as a person who had altered the course of his evening without raising her voice, without stepping out of place, simply by refusing to be reduced. "Naomi," he said, her name steady in his voice, and for a moment, it felt different from before, not just spoken, but acknowledged. "Thank you." And those two words, simple as they were, carried something new, not obligation, not politeness, but recognition, and around them, the room continued, unaware of the exact moment something had shifted, but aware that it had, and as Naomi gave a small nod, accepting the words without holding on to them, without letting them define the moment, she turned to continue her work, leaving behind a table that no longer carried the same weight it had when the night began, and Ethan remained seated for a second longer than necessary, not because he needed more time, but because for the first time in a long time, he was not in a hurry to move past a moment that had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He did not leave right away, and that alone was enough to make the night feel unfinished. Because men like Ethan Cole did not linger, they moved on. They closed moments the way they closed deals, quickly, cleanly, without looking back. But this time, something held him there, not physically, not by obligation, but by a thought that had not fully formed yet, one that refused to be dismissed as easily as everything else usually was. And as he finally stood, adjusting his jacket with the same precision that defined every movement he made, the room did not react the way it once would. No sudden shifts, no quiet retreat, just a continuation of what had already been restored, balance. And that was new, because balance meant he was no longer the force everything moved around. And as he took a step toward the exit, his gaze moved once more across the room, not searching this time, just observing, taking in the subtle changes that had unfolded without announcement. A server laughing softly at a table without checking over their shoulder, a guest speaking directly instead of through assumption, small things, almost invisible, but undeniable once seen. And near the center of it all, Naomi Carter continued her shift, not elevated, not spotlighted, just present, exactly as she had been from the beginning. And that was the part that stayed with him the most. She had not changed to create the shift, she had simply refused to disappear, and somehow that had been enough. And for a brief moment, he considered walking out without another word, letting the night remain what it was, a quiet disruption, something that would settle and fade with time. But then he stopped, just short of the door, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention, just enough to make a decision, and he turned back, not to reclaim anything, not to reassert control, but to acknowledge something he had not recognized before. And when he approached her again, it was different. No expectation, no tension, just a presence that no longer tried to dominate the space around it. "Naomi," he said, and this time, her name did not carry weight, it carried respect, and she turned, meeting him with the same calm awareness she had held all night. "Yes, sir," she replied, and there was no change in her tone. Because for her, the moment did not require one, and he nodded once, a gesture simple enough to be overlooked, but intentional enough to matter. "You were right," he said, and the words were quiet, almost private, but they landed with a clarity that did not need volume. And for a second, the world around them seemed to continue without noticing. But something in that exchange marked a line, not between them, but within him. Because recognition, real recognition, does not announce itself. It settles, it stays. And Naomi did not respond with surprise, did not shift her posture or her expression. She simply acknowledged it with a small nod, because she had never needed him to say it for it to be true. And that was the final shift, the the one that did not belong to the room or the moment, but to something deeper, something that would follow him long after he walked out, and as he turned again, this time continuing toward the door without pause. The space he left behind did not collapse. Back into what it had been, it held its new shape, quiet, steady, changed, and Naomi returned to her work, not as someone who had won, not as someone who had defeated anything, but as someone who had remained, and sometimes, that is the only power that matters, because power can fill a room, but dignity can change it.